I assume that we are connected this time around. I just wanted to thank all of the viewers who are attending today. Thank you very much for your patience. We have a sizable audience despite our having to postpone yesterday, so we're very grateful for that. We do welcome your questions and comments, so if you could please add those in the Q&A feature that you will see at the bottom of the screen. I will try my best to field these to the speakers. If you could also add your affiliation as well as the speaker to whom you're directing, that would be most helpful. Well, before I start, I take immense pleasure in inviting Guilherme Canela, who's the Chief of Section of the Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists at UNESCO, and providing some opening remarks.
Hello, thank you, Preethi. You can all hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
That's super. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today and to open this panel on a topic that is at the heart of our mandate. Deeply sorry for the problems we experienced yesterday, but I also think these lessons learned are relevant for us to deal with this so-called new normal. I'm happy to see that we have many people back today joining us remotely. The past few days have been interesting and enriching. UNESCO and partner organizations have organized a plethora of initiatives connected to the World Press Freedom Day celebrations and with this and related to this unprecedented crisis. This year's commemorations felt different to previous ones. But I'm impressed to see that there is such a strong community taking advantage of this ephemerity to create a robust echo, reminding people of the fact that we need more, and I would say much more, not less freedom of press freedom in these strange times we are living in. And why is that? Why this slogan, press freedom, more important than ever, is not just another nice advertisement, well thought one. As economists say when assessing what is going on in the economic arena, we are also facing a perfect storm when it comes to the arena of press freedom and safety of journalists. Let me remind the components of this perfect storm. Number one, emergency laws reducing freedom of expression and access to information rights, not respecting the well-established 70 years old STEPS international laws are in place in many countries. Number two, journalists are suffering physical, verbal, and digital attacks, including imprisonment, perpetrated by security forces, political leaders, and amazingly, in many countries, by the population itself, plus legal harassment. Number three, journalists all over the world are facing the highly stressing situation of losing their jobs while needing to deal with perhaps one of the most difficult reporting challenges of their lifetimes. Number four, concrete health risks, including mental health, are also a reality for journalists covering the pandemic. Number five, media outlets as companies aren't in a better situation either. Many of them under the concrete possibility of closing their operations very soon or already closed for different reasons, not only financial ones. And number six, adding to that a massive wave of disinformation, misinformation, and also hate and discriminatory speech that needs to be checked, assessed, reported, and dealt by the social media companies, bearing in mind the concerns about transparency, accountability, and alignment with international human rights standards in their actions. Wow, if this isn't a perfect storm, I don't know what could be. You can find more data and details about this in the brief Journalist Press Freedom and COVID-19 we just launched as part of the World Press Freedom Day celebrations. Therefore, indeed, as the title of this webinar underlines, it is a multifaceted challenge. I'm eager to hear your views on that. Are there other components to be added to the storm metaphor? Which key actions we need to take to tackle this problem? Was the media ecosystem unprepared to face a pandemic or a huge health natural disaster crisis? From the angle of the journalism, are there already some lessons learned? Perhaps are some of the questions that are populating my thoughts these days. The good news are that all of us, including UNESCO, have been manufacturing strong umbrellas to face the storm. I will just give a few examples to finish. As you all saw, and most of you use it, we developed a campaign for the World Press Freedom Day on the role of the independent journalism with the slogan, "More than ever, we need facts. More than ever, we need press freedom." This campaign was picked up by newspapers and other media organizations all over the world, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Rappler, Channel 22 in Mexico, and many other ones. We also have developed resources and measures aimed at bolstering safety of journalists in current environment. We have, for instance, teamed up with the World Health Organization and the Knight Center with the support of the UNDP, and launched a new massive open online course about the coverage of COVID-19, including safety issues. This course can be accessed right now in 4 different languages, and more than 80,000 journalists and media workers from 151 countries have already enrolled, which shows a deep interest in the issue. Over the coming months, UNESCO will continue to provide research and develop capacity building measures addressing concerns around the safety of journalists. In this vein, the 2020 Director General's report on safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, we will also look more closely at the protection of journalists during this crisis. And I could keep going, but I will stop here. And I'm now very much looking forward to listening to the speakers, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session if this is the case. Thank you very much for your attention, and over to you, Preethi.
Thank you very much for that overview, Guilherme. I suppose in following up with what you've provided, it's important to reiterate that there is a UN plan of action, and that calls for a more free and safe environment for journalists and media workers, both in conflict and non-conflict situations. And it actually spells out concrete actions that member states can take to create this landscape. So perhaps we ought to look at this pandemic as a way of opening that door on further public policy changes, for governments to step up and take more accountability, but for media to also to be able to better protect its own staff. So this is an opportunity for us to reimagine or reframe what national safety mechanisms mean, correct? But then in practice, we see that this involves quite a bit of navigation between advocacy, emergency preparedness, as well as long-term media development goals. And these are the tenets of the Safety of Journalists Coalition that has together convened this panel today. So this is a good segue for me to present the panelists who are an excellent representative example of that group. So I'll start with Courtney Radsch, who's the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. She is a veteran journalist herself, and she's worked in the US and the Middle East. We have Nadine Hoffman, who is the Deputy Director of the International Women Media Fund. She's been with them for 10 years, and she also leads the Journalism Relief Fund. We have Cristina Ruelas, who is the Regional Director for Article 19, and she is working on all of Central America and is based in Mexico. We have Tabani Moyo, who's speaking to us from Zimbabwe, where he is Country Director of the Media Institute of Southern Africa. He also sits on the International Freedom of Expression Exchange Council. I hope I got those bios right. The extended versions are on the link, and you also have their Twitter handles for audiences who want to communicate directly with them. So without wasting any more time, let me pose the very first question to Ana, who is speaking to us from Mexico. Since I've prefaced the Safety of Journalists Coalition, Ana, perhaps you could tell us a bit about what the findings were during the mission to Mexico that took place late last year. how do they reflect in this pandemic period, and perhaps specifically to the situation in Mexico amid this crisis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Preethi, and hi all of you. Thank you to the UNESCO for the invitation. Well, I believe that what we found during the mission, the international mission of organization that was a coalition of 20 organizations that came to Mexico. I don't know if all of you know, but Mexico is one of the countries where more journalist killings are. We have 132 killings since the 2000s, and unfortunately, most of them are still in impunity. We only have one case where there's an identification of the intellectual author of the killing in the case of Javier Valdez, but no one, like no other case has been completely solved. So that problem creates repetition all the time. We just recently have, a month ago, another killing of a journalist in Veracruz. Veracruz, one of the deadliest places for journalists in Mexico. So what the mission came to say is we need to reduce the impunity of violence against journalists. And they asked directly to the Federal Prosecutor Office to give a certain a certainty and indicators of how can we measure the reduction of impunity. However, what the findings were is that the fractures of the protection policy here in Mexico, the lack of an actual state policy to guarantee freedom of expression, leads to more violence and different types of media capture. So the problem here in Mexico is not only about violence, it has to do with a history of lack of understanding of what is to guarantee freedom of expression. And actually, during those days also, the UNESCO signed with the government the idea of evaluating with the UNESCO indicators how Mexico was in terms of freedom of expression, and we are still expecting on the results, but it is important to say that for us, the fractures right now during the COVID are more evident because violence doesn't stop because of the quarantine. You know, we have documenting just 1 month, 48 aggressions, most of them against women. And that's important to say because most of the women that are asking or trying to document around the pandemic are the ones that are getting a lot of aggressions. Actually, during the mission, one of the other findings was that any woman that intends to ask something to the president is being targeted, and is being targeted because she's a woman and because she's doing something that men do think that we should not do, that is covering and doing journalism. So it's important to say that that fracture is now more evident in this moment. Just recently, one journalist was extremely targeted and threatened through the networks, and also once she was out of the conference of the president. So I think it is important just to just bear in mind that the Mexico government needs an actual state policy to guarantee protection for freedom of expression, but also in a more broader way to guarantee freedom of expression.
Sure, absolutely. And to go from Mexico to a different country context, Tabani, you're in Zimbabwe and you've been documenting an increase in attacks against journalists and members of the press since the start of the pandemic. Could you tell us what the scenario there is? Perhaps you even see similarities with what is going on in Mexico. How has the government treated members of the press, and what are the challenges that they face at the moment? We have Tabani from Zimbabwe, please.
Thank you very much. I think there is a striking similarity with all fragile states. In that fragile states during this time of the pandemic are utilizing this opportunity to tighten grip, to consolidate their reign of power, to consolidate power into the executive through more power being given to decrease than the role of parliament. In Zimbabwe, like in Southern Africa as a sub-region, we are seeing this very same trend. If you look at, for example, a regional overview, if you take Mozambique, it records close to 72 violations in a year. And during this time of the lockdown, we have got a journalist who was actually abducted by security forces. Up to now, we are all in solidarity that there's need to release Abrahimu. Buraku, who was abducted on the 7th. If you go to Swaziland, there are 2 journalists there who are fearing for their lives for reporting the king's response to the COVID pandemic, and they are threatened with treason charges. That is Eugene Dube and Thamini. If you come to South Africa, journalists who have been in the crossfire being hit by rubber bullets. If you take a more strand, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, which is former Swaziland, and Botswana, they've all enacted laws that pretend to govern fake news, with Zimbabwe having a level 14 conviction of up to 20 years imprisonment if you are deemed to be reporting fake news. So if you then come back to Zimbabwe, it is not divorced from these fragile states. And globally, when democracy is on retreat and nations are inward looking, these regimes that are dictatorial tend to be inward looking and consolidating power. As for us, we recorded 15 cases of violations from the time we locked down, that is on the 30th of March, up to the time we went to the courts on the 15th of April. We had recorded literally a violation a day, ranging from police beating up journalists, detaining them, assaulting them, among other issues, including the military. So our action was that if we do not intervene, this curve is going to be high. Unlike the situation of flattening the curve on COVID, the Zimbabwean government was actually increasing the curve on attacks. So we then were in negotiation with the government through the parent ministry and the police. When we realized that this was structured, then we went to the courts on an urgent application. Fortunately, the courts gave us relief, instructed the police to comply within 12 hours, that the whole country should observe the constitution of Zimbabwe that allows journalists to perform their work. While we were still at the courts, the government, I think, saw that it was a bit embarrassing, then issued a statutory instrument, which then classified the industry and practice of journalism as an essential service. So this is part of the struggles of Southern Africa, but they are not divorced from what is happening in Mexico, and that's all these fragile states behave the same way when they see an opportunity that the world is busy elsewhere. There are limited checks and balances from the global eyes. Hence the need for the international solidarity platforms like these ones to also exert pressure on these fragile states.
Absolutely, and a lot of what you touched upon involves both formal efforts with the government, but also informal efforts through civil society. And then there's the larger issue of incorporating these changes into the media culture, as in newsrooms actually having protocols that safeguard its journalists. So there's the long term and the medium term, and then the emergency situation. So in going from these very specific country contexts, I'd like for Courtney at CPJ to perhaps give us a snapshot of what is going on generally across the globe, with what Tabani just mentioned, with governments basically using, or rather manipulating, emergency legislation amid the pandemic to increase surveillance on citizens, and also in some cases outright arrest and intimidation of journalists. Courtney, at the Committee to Protect Journalists, what are some of the trends that you've been noticing across the globe, really, also in the Americas as well as Europe?
Thank you. Yeah, so we have been tracking a range of threats and attacks against journalists, as we do on a regular basis. Unfortunately, COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic have not resulted in a let-up on that. And if anything, we're seeing that once again, journalists are in the crosshairs of not only the virus itself, given that there are severe safety concerns about how to cover it safely, but also in the response to the virus. So we're seeing a range of the types of threats, and we're seeing them really around the world, not only under emergency law and legislation, but one of the things that we've seen an uptick in significantly are legal restrictions that criminalize journalism and, for example, the spread of false news. Now, these laws on fake news or disinformation might be standalone laws, which we have seen increasing over the past few years. They might be embedded in health laws, or in penal codes, etc. But essentially what it's doing is it's criminalizing the publication of news, including information that may not comport with the official statistics provided by government authorities. Now, in many countries, whether we're talking about Egypt, Iraq, Kenya, even the United States, the official statistics may or may not be correct, especially in countries that have a more repressive environment with fewer protections for press freedom and journalists. This is a bigger concern. So we really rely on journalists as an independent source of information, but in many cases, reporting information that does not convey the same information as official authorities is being criminalized and has resulted in arrests, detentions, and threats. We've seen this from Zimbabwe to Taiwan to Russia. In Taiwan, you know, they have a very harsh law, but they haven't used it yet. But the point being is, you know, we're seeing these laws proliferate around the world, regardless of the political system. But of course, if you're embedded in a more repressive country or authoritarian state, we're going to see a harsher impact from this. We're also seeing that journalists are being detained, arrested, and imprisoned on charges related to COVID-19 or related to their coverage of COVID-19. This might be because they took a picture that somebody didn't want them to take. In Swaziland, there's a treason charge, equipment confiscation. In Turkey, reporting on tax issues has led to arrests. So really a range of types of reporting. We've also seen physical harassment against journalists, including at checkpoints. In much of the world, it does appear that journalists are considered essential workers. That's not the case in Iran, but it does appear that in most cases they are exempt or potentially exempt from quarantine or stay-at-home requirements. However, if you're a freelance journalist and you don't have an accreditation or a press card, you may not be able to do this. There's a lack of potential communication with the frontline people. And so we've seen police, for example, in South Africa and elsewhere, assault journalists who are trying to go out and report. We've also seen that the online harassment and rhetorical and verbal harassment of journalists has continued to be a problem throughout the world, including in democratic countries from the United States to Brazil to Philippines. We have seen verbal attacks against journalists who have questioned the presidents or other officials in power, the undermining of them, the continued attacks on Twitter and Facebook and other platforms online. We're also seeing restrictions on access to information, access to government officials, reductions in requirements around freedom of information laws or the provision of information to journalists, and restrictions on who might be granted access to limited press conferences, which is concerning. And we're looking at what are the implications of these surveillance regimes that are being rolled out across the world, some with very invasive, individualized tracking systems that include geolocation data and other tracking. What are the long-term potential impacts going to be on press freedom and the independence of journalists and the ability of journalists to protect their sources? So we're keeping an eye out on that, though we haven't seen any particular violations. And finally, I would just conclude with the issue of content moderation and the transition to automated content moderation by many of the platforms, which has inadvertently, we've seen reports of inadvertent spam filters getting news content caught up in it. And of course, we won't really know what the impact on journalistic content is from this content moderation because, of course, the platforms don't share that data with us. So we have written a letter asking for them to preserve that data. So it's really a range of attacks that we're seeing around the world. No country, no region is not experiencing some level of threats to press freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, none of us are left unscathed. Of course, the intensity has varied, but I think we've all felt the effects of this. And one way in which the impact of the pandemic has been different is very much based on gender. And one of the main concerns of the Safety of Journalists Coalition is, of course, diversity of voices in media. Now, Nadine, at the International Women's Media Foundation, what are some of the specific challenges that you've seen in terms of how female journalists experience added challenges in this period in terms of physical safety, in terms of economic protection, and in just simply accessing their stories? This is for Nadine Hoffman at International Women's Media Fund.
Thank you. I actually wanted to start by highlighting the case of just one woman journalist, and Courtney spoke a moment ago about journalists who are being imprisoned as a result of their coverage, but we're also concerned about journalists who remain in prison, who were put in prison before COVID-19 started, who are now effectively facing possibly a death sentence. And that woman is Xalapa Magdi. She's an Egyptian freelance journalist who just last September participated in a UN fellowship who was covering the UN General Assembly. She was arrested in November 2019 along with her husband on charges of spreading false news, one of those charges that governments love to use. And since then, she's been held in an indefinite pre-trial detention. The last time that her family was able to speak to her and to visit her was on March 9th. She was in really bad condition at that time. She was in poor health following a flood at the prison where she's being held in Egypt. And her family and lawyers haven't had any contact with her since then. They haven't been allowed to deliver food to her for about a month. Just last week, they were allowed to deliver food again, but they don't know her condition. And just like hundreds of other journalists who are being held around the world, she should be released immediately. So I just wanted to start by highlighting her case. But speaking more broadly, we know that in times of crisis, women and other underrepresented groups, they always carry the largest burden of that crisis. And we also have seen historically that gender equity goals and initiatives often will go by the wayside when global leaders and policymakers are tackling what they perceive to be more critical matters. But at the IWMF, we believe that gender equity is actually a critical component of freedom of expression and of our ability to have a fully representative press who tells the stories that we are reading and listening to. It directly impacts what voices the audience hears and what issues are receiving attention. So we know that when women are not represented, that high quality journalism that we need to be effective democratic societies is impossible, and that hurts us all. But speaking sort of about the everyday reality of women journalists, they're much more likely than their male peers to be primary caretakers to children or to elderly relatives. And in this current crisis of a pandemic, where reporting a story can expose those loved ones to potentially a fatal disease, we have heard extensively that many women are making that painful decision that the assignment just isn't worth the risk to their families. And that comes with a really significant loss, not just of their reporting and their voices, but also income that they urgently need. And we have seen real financial hardship, which has been exacerbated by those caretaking responsibilities. We know, we have heard, and we believe we'll see more of this, that this is going to force a lot of women out of the news industry, particularly freelancers. And that's why we have launched the Journalism Relief Fund that you mentioned at the top. This exists to provide rapid response grants to female journalists who are facing homelessness and food insecurity, who can't pay for essentials like their medicine or their utilities. Most, if not all of them, have lost assignments, they've been laid off, they've gotten sick, and they need our help now. There's been a global message about saving journalism and the importance of doing that now, and we agree with many newsrooms facing extinction. But at the IWF, we're taking that one step further to say that if we're going to save journalism, we have to save journalists first. So I'll talk a little bit more about the trends we're seeing later on.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you spoke about a very specific case, because it is really important to put names to the numbers that we're talking about. And it's also heartening for me as a practicing journalist to individualize the experiences. As you said, if you can't protect the individual members, you can't protect an entire ecosystem or an entity. That gives me a chance to actually expand a little bit also from the IMS international media support point of view, where I've been facilitating advocacy for our partners in the Middle East and North Africa. And we've been trying to sort of look at advocacy from a point of view of protecting our partners' interests in this period, but also in the new realities that will emerge. I'm trying to see if I can share this image that I had. It seems to be a little bit complicated, but we have this advocacy campaign that talks about how we should flatten the curve, but not flatline freedom of speech. And I guess that's the main premise of this particular gathering. And I wanted to actually pose the next question to Courtney, and get back a little bit to the main principles of what the Safety of Journalists Coalition has been discussing. And these are evolving discussions, of course, with different points of view. We have these three main things that we're trying to accomplish in equal measure, which is advocacy, emergency responses, and development. Courtney, at Committee to Protect Journalists, how do you manage between striking a balance between these three aspects, in the sense that during an emergency period, how do we ensure that long-term media development continues? Or how do we implement advocacy that looks at the emergency situation, but also looks at longer-term media reform? Courtney and CPJ, please.
Sure. So I think first off, the fundamental foundation of any advocacy or media development needs to be researched and understanding the scope and dimensions of the problem. And that's certainly how we conduct our advocacy at CPJ. The foundation for everything we do is the reporting. That's why we act as a news service, reporting daily on attacks against the press and threats to press freedom. So I think it's very important that in this sector, we are doing the research that needs to be done to understand the scope of the problem. The work that IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation, is doing is really important so that we understand the gender dimensions of how this is impacting journalists. The broader NGO sector, Privacy International and others who are tracking the surveillance regimes. ICNL, International Center for Nonprofit Law, which is tracking emergency laws. This needs to be a broad research effort, and it's very heartening to see that we have seen so much mobilization to document and track what is happening. But there are also big holes, so we need to continue to do that and build our advocacy on that. So one of the things that we did recently, which Nadine kind of alluded to, is really focus on an immediate, urgent situation, which is journalists in prison. So according to our last census, there were at least 250 journalists in prison around the world. That amounts to a death sentence. Those journalists are living in about 33 different countries, and you cannot practice social distancing. You cannot wash your hands regularly and do the hygienic things that need to be done. And as Nadine pointed out, in Egypt, where I used to work as a reporter as well, you depend on your family to bring you food, water, etc. And that's the case in many prisons around the world. So it's very important that we do what we can to immediately address a crisis situation, which is getting these journalists out of prison. We actually just sent a letter to the UN Secretary General. More than 190 organizations from across the press freedom and media development sphere signed on to this campaign, signed on to this open letter to world leaders. We sent a letter to the UN Secretary General telling him this has to be a priority. We'd like to see UNESCO take this up as a critical priority. They should be holding meetings and demanding action from their member states to immediately release these journalists. And it cannot be a death sentence. So that is one thing that we're doing. We also mobilize public support for that by helping the public understand that actually journalists are also frontline workers. We have the nurses, the doctors, the grocers, these other very important parts of our economy. Journalists are essential. We need them to make sure that the public is informed and to be a check on power, especially as governments are giving themselves more and more power. So as we're doing advocacy, one of the things that we're doing is looking at as these restrictions or as these new powers are being rolled out, what sort of restrictions and safeguards are being put in place to ensure that they don't have long-term detrimental impact. And I think that helping the public understand the role of journalists will be really important. And it's interesting because there has been this decline in trust in the media. in several, Western countries. And I think that this has the potential to recalibrate that trust as people recognize, actually, we need dependable institutional authorities. This is not to say that we don't also depend on citizen journalists and non-institutional journalists, especially in closed and more repressive countries like China. So China, there are still several journalists and citizen journalists who are missing, who are detained, and they are, why we know them, the citizens in China, citizen doctors who made sure that we had information around the world to know about. So I think it's making sure that we're telling the stories about why journalism matters, and we're doing the research to allow us to come up with effective, meaningful advocacy campaigns and understand where we need to focus, where is the biggest concern. Is it emergency laws, or are they the proliferation of false news laws, et cetera? So right now, our current advocacy is focused on grassroots campaigning and direct governmental advocacy, much of that taking place virtually, as with so much of the rest of our lives. But what's heartening is to see how quickly the community has come together to recognize that journalists are frontline workers, that we need to mobilize to protect them, and that governments need to make sure that they're held accountable for how they treat journalists.
Absolutely. And taking it back to the country context, I actually want to switch back to what Cristina Ruelas has been working on in not just in Mexico, but across the region in Central America, where some of these structural provisions or legislation has been sorely lagging. And this has been amplified in this pandemic period. Anna, perhaps you could tell us what this means in practice. How does this lack of structural provisions affect or hinder journalists in actually carrying out their job in terms of access to stories or just being able to report a story fully? Anna, in Mexico.
Yeah. Definitely I have to describe what Courtney said, because I believe that the problem is based on the lack of knowledge of the essentiality of journalism. I think for all of us it's very clear that while we are in-house, there are people that are outside giving us information in order for us to decide. And I think that's a very important thing that we have to keep in mind. In the case of Mexico, journalists are in a very bad situation. Like, it's not only about violence, it's also about precarity of their jobs, if they don't cover some of the things that they are covering, they are going to lose their jobs. And then it's not going to be about the pandemic, it's going to be about the hunger. And I think it's important to understand that, because sometimes we, here in Mexico and in the countries of the region, we do not realize how is it considered to do journalism in a condition where you have to write to be paid? Like the note that you write has to be published in order to get paid. You don't get paid just because of that, because you write. You need to be published in order to get paid, and that's a reality that is very hard to understand, because it's also a type of economic violence that journalists live here in these countries. I also will have to say that, as Courtney said, there's a lot of a proliferation of news or of laws that are intending to criminalize freedom of expression. But for us, it's only a reflection of authoritarianism, and the idea, is the opportunity for authoritarian governments to come forward and say, this is a new one that I can get because I just got the criminalization of defamation. Here in Mexico, we still have, for example, a lot of the state governments that have the criminalized defamation. We also have laws that criminalize even the images, like the memes. So as absurd as it looks, there's a lot of things or crimes that are still used to go against journalists. You can go to jail if you ask the government about security issues here in Mexico in 24 states. So that's the kind of things that we're facing. And so we have now a proliferation of trying to criminalize fake news, not only in Mexico, but also in some of the countries of Central America. In the case of Honduras, just as they started to try to target the contingency, the president launched a decree saying that freedom of expression was one of the rights that would not be guaranteed during the pandemic. Then he had to retract himself. However, even that he retract himself, he's not letting journalists to cover anything around the pandemic. He's doing a lot of blocking to the journalists, so they are not even able to know about the numbers or how the pandemic is spreading around the country. In Guatemala, even though they said that they were going to consider and recognize freedom of expression, the government and the president spread disinfectant to the journalists, and he said that it would be good to make them all go into quarantine. And we have a set of quotes from the different presidents and governments doing a lot of stigmatization against the press. And as I said in the beginning, like, this is a bigger risk for journalists that are already in a huge risk. Violence against journalists in these countries are an everyday way of life. So, for example, in the case of Mexico, Guerrero or Veracruz are two of the states that are very dangerous to journalists. And just in the beginning of the quarantine, while the governments are focusing on trying to defend the public health, the organized crime comes out and tries to go against journalists because it's the first thing that they want. So we had to make a lot of forced displacement for journalists in Guerrero, along with the mechanism of protection in order to put them in safe, because the situation was very harsh. In the case of Veracruz, as I mentioned before, Maria Elena Ferral was killed after a set of threats from public officials. So, and I think the investigation is not going nowhere. So, because of the pandemic, and so this is just a circle. And what I want to just repeat is that when we are speaking about killing a journalist or an aggression against a journalist, it's about it's a killing of the possibility for us to know what is happening outside. And I think it's important because in Mexico, it has always been about the message. When you kill a messenger, you are actually killing the message, and you're actually making the messenger the message for the other journalists to stop saying what they want to say. So I think that all the stigmatization from public officials that they are putting forward, like just last week, the president of Mexico just said that in Mexico there was an independent journalist, that all journalists in Mexico were totally co-opted, etc. These declarations divide society from journalists and stop them to protect them, because the only thing that journalists have are the audiences, the audiences that can protect their word. So I believe it is very important for us and for all the audience that is hearing us to know that going against a journalist through the wars, through the stigmatizations or through their killings or through laws that are criminalizing, have a clear intent message in order for us not to know. We always say that, yeah. So
no, and I just wanted to, there's much more to elaborate on that, and I also want to allow some time for question and answers, and we'll definitely get back to some of the themes you mentioned, but it also is somehow related to what Tabani in Zimbabwe has been dealing with. And so I would love to hear from you in terms of strategies that you've used, Tabani, in Zimbabwe, but also maybe on a regional level, just as Anna has mentioned, that there's similarities between these countries, but they're also unique contexts. And there's a lot of information to be shared there, wisdom to be shared. What has been working in terms of your strategies? I imagine you're undertaking a lot of informal activities as well, collaborations with civil society. What are some of your efforts in the short and the medium term, say the next year following hopefully the end of this pandemic? What has been working, and again, some similarities probably with Mexico, Tabani and Zimbabwe.
Thank you. I think the most critical point to note here is that our best shield is the strength of solidarity globally, especially at the time when we are in combatments, that each respective unitary state is dealing with the pandemic, trying to contain it and flatten the curve. In our case, we have taken a very strong engagement approach that we need to engage the most of those violators, specifically those men and women in uniform, the police and the military. That is in the Zimbabwean context, but also it's not localized. What starts in Zimbabwe end up in Botswana, we end up in Zambia, we end up in South Africa. As has happened with the issue of regulation on fake news. It started with the economic power of South Africa, and without much time, it was in Zimbabwe, it was in Botswana, it was in Swaziland. These trends are not localized anymore. So the strength of solidarity is one of our unlocking mechanisms towards dealing with issues of attacks and violations. If it is a small scale at Zimbabwean level, the world can manage to ignore it and move on. But if there is that strong human-to-human solidarity network that a journalist is imprisoned, like the case in Mozambique of Mburako, that has been in detention since the 7th of April. We have seen a lot of collaboration from AFEX, from CPJ, petitioning the global order. That don't forget there are journalists that are incarcerated. At continental level, there are almost 36 journalists that are in prison, that were in prison before the pandemic broke out. So at local level, at regional level, firstly, engagement with the policymakers so that we push as much as is possible the restrictions that comes with the law. Utilizing UN calendar events has been one of our key interventions, like the day of the World Press Freedom Day commemorations. Africa is also fortunate that it has recently declared the 28th of September as the right to know date, which will also coalesce with the policymakers, the users. Above all, the Commission on Human and People's Rights has just completed reviewing the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and now recognize internet as a right, which means that it is going to exert pressure on member states to act accordingly in terms of defending journalists online and offline. Only last year in November, we brought a mission from AFEX, that's the African subgroup of IFEX, which brought together the various players in collaboration with UNESCO Southern Africa. And they met policymakers in Zimbabwe, the ministry, the police, and insisted that we need a collective intervention to protect journalism, of which we have started the process of engagement. That's why we are always on the table before we go the next step. When we see that the table is not unlocking favorable results, we then engage the courts in strategic litigation or in civil litigation. Civil in that if journalists are attacked, we want to raise the cost of this recurring. So we sue those people who have attacked the journalists in person so that it becomes a deterrent. But above that, we are seeing that during COVID lockdown, there is a critical element which is emerging, the issue of cost of data as a new threat to journalism. That's the level of journalistic enterprise has drifted to online platforms, and that citizens are now utilizing online platforms even to gain services. But the level of costs in Southern Africa and Africa in general are quite steep. So we also approached the courts in two cases. The first one was to deal with journalists being allowed to do their work without harassment from police. The second one was to order government to release information which is comprehensive on all platforms in all local languages that are recognized by the Constitution. So these are some of the interventions that we have seen to be yielding results. But above all, we need to rethink collaboration, because what starts in Zimbabwe will end up in Egypt, we end up in Europe. So we really need to start rethinking collaboration on how best to share knowledge and experiences that can better strengthen the safety nets for journalism. Also rethinking solidarity, especially during these moments whereby the fragile states by their nature technically have suspended constitutions. The role of parliament is minimum. Presidential decrees are being used, and without clear terms of when and where they are going to end. So the issue of journalism in Southern Africa is that of facing the daily threat on one hand to tell the Southern African story, on the other hand, possibility of contracting the deadly pandemic, while on the extreme end, facing attacks, the possibility of detentions, of abductions, possibilities of shootings, like specifically in Mozambique, which is a democracy gone amok. In Tanzania, a democracy gone amok, a mixture of legal and extra-legal interventions in dealing with the media. So these are some of the issues that we have taken into our strides. Firstly, engagement. Secondly, if engagement is not working, strategic litigation. If strategic litigation is not working, we strengthen the solidarity network through petitioning of our global partners in raising issues and the cost of violations in Zimbabwe, so that it becomes a global story. Not only the Zimbabwean story, but Zambia recently closed a television station, Prime TV, for refusing to flight messaging before being paid the long-standing debt by the Zambian government. So it's a mixed bag, which is mainly aimed at deterrent safety measures and also a defense fund to hedge interventions by the media.
Absolutely, and you touched upon a key word there, which is collaboration, and that we need it across regions, within regions, on a global level, because we're starting to see very similar behavior in terms of what Anna mentioned, with leaders stigmatizing, actually reporting factual elements of the pandemic, but also in terms of using it to repress free speech in other situations. So it's made the role of journalists even more complex and complicated. And so that brings me to sort of maybe a reflection before we open up the Q&A round. I see a few questions in here. Nadine, could you please reflect for us perhaps how the idea of collective action or collaboration has changed for your organization, given that, given this experience of this crisis? How do you think you would change your programs to adapt to the post-pandemic realities? Nadine Hoffman?
I think that there has never been a moment where there is more need for us to effectively work together across the press freedom community and media development communities. You know, the scale of this problem is overwhelming. I've heard a lot of my colleagues today talking about, you know, how this will destroy the livelihoods of so many journalists and will effectively make them unable to continue. You know, just in our own experience and having opened our Journalism Relief Fund about a month ago, we've had 1,000 requests from 100 countries, from journalists in 100 countries. That means that journalists are experiencing the same hardship, whether they're in Mexico or in Zimbabwe or in Ukraine. It's affecting them all. And we need media outlets also to really, we know that they're in a huge position of financial hardship as well, but we need them to step up to take steps to better protect the journalists who are bringing us this news as essential workers, whether those are staff journalists who we're hearing from who have been laid off or who have taken pay cuts or who have been asked to continue to report for free, which is something we've heard from a number of journalists, or whether it's freelancers on whose backs really the media industry is built. And those freelancers have very few protections. They have been, just really left in a terrible position by major media outlets included, who have, canceled contracts without paying cancellation fees. We are hearing from journalists all around the world who are working without protective gear, whose newsrooms have not provided them with masks and gloves. These are sort of baseline considerations, and I think that as a global community who serves journalists, it's up to us to really hold to account the decision makers in the media industry, and to tell them these are baseline things that they need to be providing to their journalists. And also just sort of like looking ahead to the long term implications of this pandemic, what we're really afraid of seeing is that it will destroy the gains that have been made towards gender equity and diversity in newsrooms. And so we want to make sure that we continue to advocate, that we're hearing from those voices that we're very much afraid will get lost.
Absolutely. And there's actually a question from one of our viewers that could be answered by you. It keeps scrolling down. Just give me 1 second and let me find this. So it was basically about journalists who've been imprisoned across the world. Is it possible, do we have an account based on gender, and where are a majority of them? And would you have any map that basically shows where they are, the gender, and the situation, more as a resource, I suppose?
I think this question probably goes better to Courtney, because we aren't tracking that globally, but I know that CPJ is.
I can answer that. Systematically track the journalists who are killed and imprisoned around the world. We try to do missing as well. If you go to cpj.org/data, you can explore all of the data. You can find out the individual names of the journalists. You can find out gender, what beat were they working on, who was likely responsible for their death. Was it murder? Was it crossfire? What charges are they imprisoned on? So you can explore all of that in our database. And there was a question about the longest imprisoned journalist on there, and that would be an Eritrean journalist, Gebrehewet Kaleta, who's been in prison since 2000. My colleagues, thankfully, on the side just texted me that. So thank you for that support. But yes, so all of that data is available. But also remember, we also have profiles on every single journalist, because of course we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about each individual and the repercussions that their imprisonment, their killing, or their disappearances have, not only on their families, but also on the communities that they cover.
Great. That's actually a pretty comprehensive answer to that. I was just looking at a new one that just came in. This one's directed to Cristina. It's from Jose Benitez, and he's asking you if you can talk about what's happening with journalists in Nicaragua in the context of this pandemic.
Well, first of all, I think it's important for me to say that it's mainly Article 19 works in Honduras, Guatemala, Cuba, and Mexico. However, we do have information about the strongest authoritarianism like getting stronger, in Nicaragua with Ortega, and I think it is very important to say that even though the pandemic gets it worse, as I said before, what is happening right now is that everything that has been done in the past year against the press in Nicaragua is making it more evident. So I would not say specific cases, because we haven't documented anything about like specific cases right now. I think maybe Courtney would have some information about Nicaragua specifically that can answer in a more deeper way.
Yeah, and again, I would direct you to the website. You can look at all of the press freedom violations by specific country, but I know that we have done some interviews with Nicaraguan journalists, and we've heard reports that they're facing police harassment, surveillance, and Nicaragua is seen as Central America's center of virus denial. So it's very challenging to do reporting in a country where the fake news mantra is so strong. So I invite you to go to the website and check out our page on Nicaragua.
Great, thank you for that. And there was another anonymous question. I do not have viewers, please do provide your name and affiliation because it does help. It helps me scroll through them at least. So the question was actually very interesting. How many media outlets actually have a press freedom beat covering the status of press freedom laws, activities, pros and cons? That's a really interesting question as part of an international affairs beat. Maybe we can make that a little bit more country specific and go to Tabani. Is there a lot of coverage of the issue by journalists themselves that belong to different media outlets? Because there is, of course, value in covering it as a beat on its own. Tabani.
Unfortunately, it's not a standalone beat, but as I said, that we have staggered our campaigns around freedom of the press, mainly riding on the UN calendar events, and also through our media support components. Each issue which we identify as a potential huge issue, as the big thing that might be emerging, we then plan it so that we roll it out to empower the media to better articulate the concerns that are arising from the practice, so that they are not theoretical, but they are coming from the ground. This will also try to interlink between the journalists and the law enforcement agencies at various stages of the country, because they have got different contact persons at different levels. This is mainly aimed at minimizing conflict. In other instances, we have started providing identification support so that when there are riotous situations, they know how best to respond. These are issues that have been emerging from interactions between the police and the media itself. But to allocate a specific person dealing with the key issues from the violations of that the media are facing, it's quite peculiar. It's not yet in Zimbabwe, mainly because the models are changing. The business is facing pressure to work with minimum level of staffers. So that's the main challenge.
Okay, I have another question here addressed to IWMF or CPJ. Are there aspects related to safety of journalists that have an outsized impact on women journalists during the pandemic? I think you addressed some of this, but maybe from the legal safety points of view, or other issues related to press freedom. Either of you could take turns. Either of you could answer this question. Perhaps you want to start, Nadine?
Sure, I'll start on that. One issue that we know has outsized impact on women, regardless of whether there's a pandemic, has always been online abuse and harassment. As we heard a little bit earlier from Cristina in Mexico, that is certainly a global phenomenon. We're actually about to launch a survey next week to look at trends in online harassment related to the pandemic to see whether there has been any increase. Anecdotally, we've heard that the kinds of abuse that are increasing are around specific kinds of journalists. So we've heard that, for example, Asian American journalists are facing a huge uptick in harassment, as well as science journalists, which is really interesting. So we don't know what the gender implications are right now of the pandemic and whether that has made it worse for women journalists, but we know that they do experience far more online abuse than their male counterparts in general. Again, the issue of being usually primarily the caretakers of either children or elderly relatives who may be immunocompromised does increase the economic hardship. And I do think that even though, that's not per se a safety issue, that livelihoods are very closely connected to the safety of journalists. We've heard anecdotally from journalists who are pregnant, who have been fired by their newsrooms. We've heard several cases of that actually in Kosovo, and we believe that that was linked, they believe that that was linked specifically to the fact that their newsrooms didn't want to be responsible for paying their maternity leave during a very difficult economic time. But certainly the issues that we're hearing through our relief fund disproportionately are affecting freelancers at large who have lost almost all of their income, who are working very often without, the resources to be able to adequately protect themselves with, the masks, gloves, PPE, and the backing from major media outlets.
Thank you for that. And I have a series of questions, so I do want to move on to the next one. Well, this one is from Aurora Karameti, and Aurora asks do the media have any written document or guarantee that can guarantee the security of their journalists? I suppose it's more about what different media approaches could guarantee the security of the journalists. If not, should it become mandatory after this pandemic? Perhaps, let's say, Courtney could field this question.
Sure. So there are no, in many cases, there are no mandatory requirements that newsrooms provide safety, guidance or initiatives for their journalists outside of, say, any framework that exists around occupational safety, which obviously varies by country. I think one of the big developments over the past few years is the creation of the ACOS Alliance, which stands for a culture of safety. And it really started out of the, after the murders of Stephen Sotloff and Jim Foley, and realizing that, people, that newsrooms need to have a moral responsibility for caring and the safety of their freelancers. That now we're seeing translate into some of the discussions now around COVID-19 and how newsrooms are responding, what sort of support they are taking for their newsrooms, for their journalists, and for freelancers. So, there's safety training that is provided. The members of ACOS and the signatories to the ACOS kind of freelancer safety journalist, freelancer journalist safety document have agreed on this moral principle, but it's not a binding legal document. That said, there has been some really important developments. We are working together on safety protocols for news organizations, which both CPJ and IWMF are partners on this. We have created resources through the ACOS Alliance, including a COVID-19 webpage that lists all these relevant webinars on safety and links to resource hubs, a newsletter of curated sources. We have been delivering safety trainings, and ACOS negotiated some insurance scheme for freelancers in advance of the COVID that is for, what was very hard for freelancers to get insurance before that. So, we are seeing that there is much more attention to the issue of safety, but there are still enormous gaps. I just reported out a piece about freelancers, and a lot of them are saying that they don't get the support that they need from their newsrooms, that they're not having those conversations, or they're not getting assignments at all because there's no funding for that. And interestingly, I heard an anecdote from one freelancer who said that that freelancer was having those conversations more with some of the state-funded news organizations like Xinhua or Agence France-Presse or other state-funded news organizations, which I think has interesting implications that need to be delved into further.
Thank you for that, Courtney. I've had this question sitting here for a bit, which is quite interesting, and this can be answered by any of you, I suppose. Is Guilherme with us? If he is, then that would be excellent as well. Are there any world leaders who are considered press freedom advocates? Is there a possibility of identifying them as a counter to the leaders who are openly anti-press freedom? perhaps a coalition of the pro-press freedom world leaders could reach out as a group. Which one of you would like to answer that? Is Guilherme with us?
I'm happy to jump in there because
Sure.
on the Media Freedom Coalition Advisory Network, so the Media Freedom Coalition was created by the UK government in Canada and has brought together 30-some countries that ostensibly have signed on to a pledge to support media freedom. So right now we have some, I think, rhetorical support, but frankly, I would say no, we're not seeing any leadership on this issue globally. It has not been at the forefront of the agenda. We've seen a vacuum that has been left by US leadership. And while the UK has said that it wants to lead on this issue, I think we are still waiting and we're not holding our breath because we just had World Press Freedom Day and we did not see them demand, for example, that the countries that have signed the pledge do anything to actually implement media freedom. We didn't see them call on their diplomatic colleagues to release journalists from jail. So it's a huge vacuum, and I think that's why we're seeing the deterioration of press freedom around the world, and we're seeing that things like pervasive surveillance laws, false news laws, and unrestricted emergency laws can be passed around the world. So we'd love to see some leadership, but we aren't seeing any there yet.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question is a little bit more on the philosophical side. It's from, let's see, I'm being scrolled automatically. Okay, well, it's from Stollywick from University of Oslo, who says, who uses Arundhati Roy's sentence, if the pandemic is a portal and we're entering a new world, what does this world of the media of tomorrow look like, say, in 1, 2, or 3 years? Because there's no doubt that there have been changes that, are irreversible. So what has changed the most? What should have changed for the better in, say, the next 3 years for media to be able to do its job better? If you'll allow me, Courtney, I'll just start with maybe these big quick reflections. I'll start with a specific context, Anna, and then Tabani, and then maybe Courtney, and after that, Nadine.
So, well, what I believe is that we need more independent media. Many media in the countries I work at depend on public money, and that public money defines the editorial lines of the media. So I think it's important for journalists to be actually free also from the money that the government decides how they have to write. I think there should be a bigger consideration of the public on the importance of the media in order to have them survive, without the public money, because it's also important to say that in countries like mine, there are states or places where there's no possibility to live without public money also. So we need to also strengthen community radio stations in order to have more information in the communities where traditional media or independent media that works through the digital do not get there. We have a lot of people that do not have access to internet, so we need to rely on community radio stations also, and we need to believe that community radio stations are also a very good way through. So I think that sometimes as we are connected, we believe everyone is. So I think, and my expectations are that we also consider all those people that are not connected in order to go back a little bit and consider all of the other things that we have to still make stronger in order to actually have independent media and to have a stronger journalism. Like most of the journalists that are killed here in Mexico are not the journalists that are in the mainstream media, are the ones that are in the base, in the ground base, that are giving information about the smallest thing of corruption. There are cases as Moises Sanchez that was killed in Veracruz in 2015, that he was a journalist that was giving information about water, about public services, and he was killed because he was uncomfortable for the power. So I believe it's just a thing to believe in journalism, to understand that journalism it's also opportunity for us as audiences to make better decisions, to not believe that everything is related to connections and digital and in the digital era, because we still have many people that does not have access. And I think we need to find another way, and media have to find another way to finance themselves, and we need to find more projects in order to try to push for more independent media.
Sure. But you've been putting out simultaneous fires in the immediate term, but I'm sure you're also hoping for long-term legislation. So to answer the same question, in 3 years' time, what would help you in your fight in Zimbabwe and in the region in Southern Africa?
Indeed, I think the leading pillar is that there's no replacement for solidarity globally as a shield, as it is going through a retreat, like Courtney said, that there's no leadership, and the vacuum is imminent. In the immediate term, what we need is a stronger outward-looking mindset, both at national levels, but also at regional levels, that people are increasingly thinking beyond their geographical interests. And that there's a lot of sharing of knowledge, so that we move away from, we had in the past 3 decades or so, we had moved from the main arguments in Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically that of ownership structure, that we want independent media compared to public media. We had literally, in a way, won a bit of gains, and had drifted towards issues of strengthening professionalism, remodeling in the face of the internet, of the business models, among other issues. But post-COVID, the main challenge is that we shall be going back to the debates of 3 decades ago of structural nature of the media in Africa and in Southern Africa, because most of them would have collapsed in the independent media, where we have state dominance again in media ownership. And this will be leaning strongly on heavy laws that are supporting this established media in terms of public good and state ownership. So I think in the medium term, there's need for outward thinking, increased collaboration around what's working where and how best can it be replicated in supporting local realities and contexts, so that we do not go back to the debates of 3 decades ago, and we maintain a vibrancy in the independent media, but also attending to issues of content generation in the age of the new. What are the touch points that we need to strengthen in terms of the skill that the journalist is gaining in the post-COVID pandemic? Is the journalist still fit for purpose in terms of multi-platform content generation? How do we gear it up so that they remain competitive in churning out verified information? Above all, support of the industry by the audience. Most of the young users of the media products believe that they only find the content online. It just came there, but there is a whole industry underneath which generates the content, which is easy to share because it's verified online. So in the fight for disinformation, misinformation, we need stronger legislation that is enabling the media to perform its work, rather than security-centric legislation that is deterring use of the platforms and also deterring the industry from performing its major roles.
Sure, absolutely. And Guilherme is actually still with us, so let's take this opportunity to ask a question from a PhD student who's working on a researcher who's working on safety of journalists. There are so many threats to journalists that it costs to legal restrictions, and the current protections, laws, and protocols don't work. Could more be done to provide resource safety training for journalists so they can better protect themselves? Guilherme, if you're still there, maybe you want to take that question.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, super. Let me just, I will gladly take that one, but let me just add something to the previous question, working on something Anna has said. We are very much obviously worried with the survival of journalism as such and the media companies as well. So we this week we had a webinar that Anna also participated on the issue of media independence and the risks of media capture. And we want to insist in this discussion of journalism as a public good and how to fund journalism as a public good, but avoiding the risks of media capture and of diminishing independence. So we are going to use the World Trends Report series on freedom of expression and media development in the next months to further discuss this idea. What is journalism as a public good and how to protect the independence and avoid media capture in this current context that unfortunately will keep going even when we are able to tackle the current crisis. On the question that the PhD student did, indeed, this is a very important issue. There are many areas that we need to enhance, but perhaps I would like to underline good news. As many of you know, UNESCO has now for 6 years developed an initiative that we call the Judges Initiative that have been training judicial operators in more than 60 countries. We have already reached more than 17,000 judges and prosecutors. This World Press Freedom Day, we just signed another partnership with the Ibero-American Association of Attorney Generals. Prosecutors are instrumental and very important in this process of investigating the crimes against journalists. So one of the elements here is that we need to look broader. We need to include other stakeholders that perhaps are not the usual suspects that we normally work with. So judges and prosecutors, for instance, are very important here in guaranteeing the implementation of the international standards, fighting impunity, but even protecting press freedom when a crime hasn't happened yet. So he's right, but I think there are positive news, and the interest of those judicial operators is not a minor thing. That having 17,000 judges and prosecutors in more than 60 countries that are interested in this subject is already good news. So we need to work more on that area. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. In returning to what the 3-year outlook could look like, question for you, Nadine, that makes it more specific. It's from Marianne Saylor, who asks about how working on gender equal payment and safety, which continue to be a big issue in the industry, what can be done differently in the period following this pandemic to promote gender equality with concrete results? Nadine?
Sure. So I think that my hope is that in 3 years that all journalists are recognized as being essential workers, and that there is a newfound appreciation for having our news brought to us by a diversity of voices, and recognizing that we're getting the full picture only when we have the equal participation of women in this news industry. And that we are actually going further and continuing the important work that ACOS and many other organizations have been doing to try to build this coalition around safety, that we need to protect all journalists. I guess the flip side, the fear is that none of those things will happen, and that this could instead roll us very far backwards and will in fact very much hurt our ability to get the full picture from a robust and equal gender equal news industry.
Thank you for that. That's pretty spot on. I think that's what the question really was about. And in concluding that thought, I thought, Courtney, this is a good one for you. And again, it does, if you could include that sort of 3-year scenario. Sylvia Shucaro asks, the event is organized by this international coalition. How relevant is coordination among organizations at the local, national, regional, and international level? Do you think there's need for more collaboration among CSOs, media, journalists themselves to increase the protection? What else can be done? Courtney.
Okay, let me take the second point first and then address the 3-year outlook. I think that there are some very good examples of coordination happening. I think ACOS is a great example where they are helping to coordinate some of the advocacy with news organizations, the safety webinars and resources. There is also the International Freedom of Expression Network, which coordinates freedom of expression advocacy on a range of issues. I am concerned that coordination can take the place of action, and there is a proliferation of coordination. You know, it was mentioned earlier, the UNESCO, you know, plan of action on safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. And, you know, I think we have seen a few successes from there, but again, you know, it needs more backing from high level political will from the UN Secretary General, et cetera. It needs to be implemented throughout the UN. You know, and that was another coordination mechanism that I think didn't really, you know, it hasn't really turned out to be what it could have been. And having also worked at UNESCO, you know, I definitely wanted that to succeed. I think we're still trying to make it, you know, into something that could be helpful. But I do worry that we are doing so much coordination in our sector that we're not having the time to actually do the action. So I think we need to balance those two things. That said, there are, you know, another really effective coordination that's very nimble and responsive is the Journalists in Distress Network, which provides emergency assistance and guidance to journalists who are under threat. And that's a great example of actually coordination that actually has impact. So, you know, we need to make sure that we're not doing coordination for coordination's sake and that we're actually having an impact. With respect to what this means for the 3-year outlook, it is important, you know, coordination will play a role in this because, you know, looking at how do we gather, going back to an earlier point, how do we gather the information we need in order to make plans for media development and advocacy on press freedom effectively? Let's not all do the same research. Let's collaborate on that research. Let's share results. Let's think about, you know, we're coordinating around safety training to make sure that different organizations can provide the best training. We're not duplicating, we're making sure to reach new audiences. So, you know, I think that holds some promise, and I hate to be the last person here and end on a negative note, but I think if we look three years out, we are in a desperate situation in the news industry. I mean, we are seeing the devastation of freelance journalism. And as Nadine pointed out in an article that I wrote recently where I quoted her, you know, the news industry is built on the back of freelancers. You know, they are the vast majority of foreign correspondents. They cover local communities for global audiences. You know, and this is going to be really, really challenging to rebuild that. I think that as we're seeing already the news industry was under severe economic pressure, as we all know, and this is only compounding it. We didn't talk about that, but the economic devastation of the advertising industry is going to have a massive impact. It's already had a massive impact on the news industry, which relies on its little tiny breadcrumbs left over from Google and Facebook, you know, for some of its survivorship. We don't want to turn into a government dependency, but we have to look at how are journalists going to be potentially supported by some of the economic programs that are going to be rolled out to support workers. Where again do freelancers fall? I mean, there's so many journalists who are kind of part of this. So what we now call the gig economy, what we call freelancers in journalism. You know, so I think there are some serious questions. I'm concerned about a further consolidation among, you know, very well-funded news outlets, you know, that are funded as side projects of billionaires or of major corporations that are, media or entertainment or otherwise focused, and what that might do. So I think we need to be very, very vigilant in seeing what direction we're headed out. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the long-term implications of the surveillance regimes that we're setting up are going to be profound. Let's not forget what happened after 9/11 and the so-called war on terror and the vast powers of surveillance that we gave to our governments and how that was abused and manipulated to including, track journalists and hold people without trial, without any due process. We cannot let that happen again as the response to the coronavirus. So again, I hate to be the Debbie Downer of the conclusion of this seminar, but this is a pivotal moment, portal moment, as was mentioned earlier, and I don't think we yet know where that portal is leading. And so we will all need to be very vigilant in ensuring that it leads to a future where there is independent journalism and where press freedom is respected.
Absolutely, and I do have to reiterate what you said in terms of, we've talked about safety, access to information, and the logistics of delivering the story and the physical safety of journalists, but we didn't have enough time to actually look at the economic protection. It's very clear that the business models of news media are failing, they're reeling. Advertising revenue has been a major source of economic support, and we're seeing that that's just not going to work in the period moving forward. So that actually brings us back to the issue of collaboration, not just as organizations that support media, but also as media themselves, that it starts to behave more like an ecosystem where media of different sizes and specializations start working together much more collaboratively rather than competitively. So that is a whole another seminar that we could arrange, because as I was arranging this panel and familiarizing myself with the Safety of Journalists Coalition, my colleagues at IMS who've been active with the coalition from its inception reminded me that the key word here is dialogue. And by that, they mean dialogue between the media, government, and civil society organizations, and within media itself. And I suppose all of you have been talking about that as advocates and facilitators of better dialogue. And as Robert Shaw, who leads the Global Safety Program at IMS, put it really well, we're all across the board, whether we're in Denmark, Lebanon, Mexico, Zimbabwe, or the US, we are relearning how to talk to each other. So I do hope that we continue this dialogue, and we're obviously finding ways of having these virtual discussions, which are, let's face it, much more frugal compared to what we used to do or what we've been used to doing. So we're adapting, and so let's continue this dialogue. And it's right about time when we should be wrapping up. So with that in mind, thank you very much to everyone. I did want to say a quick thank you. And if I've done this already, then my days are very similar. So I might have just thought about it yesterday and I'm repeating myself. Many, many thanks to Colette Hefner at IMS, who put this panel together on such short notice, and to Teresa Horbacher and the technicians at UNESCO who've been producing this show. And really thanks to all the participants. There are quite a few questions left still, and they're very specific and directed at the panelists. It is very much possible to answer these, type the answers, so we'll keep this conversation going, and you have all the needed information of the panelists in the link to this program. So I do hope this is just the start of the conversation. Thanks to everyone for coming together and coming together so well and making my job easier today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye, everyone.